The rain hammered against the windshield of Marcus Sullivan's black pickup truck as he drove through the winding mountain roads back to his ranch. Thunder rolled across the Wyoming sky, and lightning split the darkness every few seconds. At 62, Marcus had seen plenty of storms in his lifetime, but this one felt different. More violent, more unpredictable. He adjusted his grip on the steering wheel and squinted through the sheets of water cascading down his windshield. The wipers were working overtime, but they could barely keep up with the downpour. Marcus had been in town for a meeting with his accountant, going over the quarterly reports for Sullivan Ranch Enterprises. The numbers were good, better than good, actually. His cattle operation, combined with his real estate investments and the small oil wells scattered across his 15,000 acres, had made him one of the wealthiest men in 3 counties. But wealth had never been what drove Marcus Sullivan. Even now, driving through this storm, he was thinking about the new irrigation system he wanted to install next spring, the breeding program he was developing for his prize Angus cattle, and the scholarship fund he'd been quietly building for local kids who wanted to study agriculture but couldn't afford college. A flash of lightning illuminated the road ahead, and Marcus saw something that made him slam on his brakes. The truck skidded slightly on the wet asphalt before coming to a stop. There, huddled against a broken-down sedan on the side of the road, was a figure wrapped in what looked like a soaked blanket. Marcus grabbed his emergency flashlight from the glove compartment and pulled his cowboy hat down tight. He stepped out into the storm, immediately feeling the cold rain soak through his jacket. As he approached the abandoned car, he could see it was a woman. She was sitting on the ground beside the passenger door, holding something close to her chest. "Mom," Marcus called out, raising his voice over the wind and rain. "Ma'am, are you hurt?" The woman looked up, and in the beam of his flashlight, Marcus saw a face that would stay with him for the rest of his life. She was young, maybe 25 or 30, with dark hair plastered to her head by the rain. Her eyes were wide with fear and exhaustion, and tears mixed with rainwater streamed down her cheeks. But what stopped Marcus cold was what she was holding, a tiny baby wrapped in a thin blanket that was already soaked through. "Please," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the storm. "Please help my baby." Without hesitation, Marcus shrugged off his heavy ranch coat and wrapped it around both the woman and child. "Come on," he said gently. "Let's get you both out of this weather." The woman struggled to stand, and Marcus could see she was weak from cold and exhaustion. He helped her to his truck, making sure the baby stayed covered and dry. Once they were inside the warm cab, Marcus cranked up the heat and turned to get a better look at his unexpected passengers. The baby couldn't have been more than 6 months old. Its little face was pale, and Marcus could see the child was shivering despite being wrapped in multiple blankets now. The mother was in almost as bad shape. Her lips had a blue tint, and her hands were shaking uncontrollably. "How long were you out there?" Marcus asked as he put the truck in drive and headed toward his ranch. "Since this morning," the woman said through chattering teeth. "My car broke down around dawn. I've been waiting for someone to come by, but hardly anyone uses this road." Marcus knew she was right. This particular stretch of mountain highway was mostly used by ranchers and hunters. In a storm like this, most people would take the main interstate, even if it added an extra hour to their drive. "I'm Marcus Sullivan," he said, glancing at her in the rearview mirror. "What's your name?" "Sarah," she replied softly. "Sarah Chun. And this is Emma." She looked down at the baby in her arms, and Marcus saw fresh tears start to flow. "Well, Sarah, you and Emma are safe now. My ranch is just a few miles ahead. We'll get you both warmed up, fed, and into some dry clothes." Sarah nodded, but didn't say anything more. Marcus could tell there was more to her story, a lot more. The car she'd been in was at least 10 years old, with Colorado plates. The clothes she was wearing, while soaked, looked expensive, but her shoes were worn through at the heels, and her purse, which sat on the seat beside her, was held together with tape. The rain was still coming down hard when Marcus turned through the stone gates that marked the entrance to Sullivan Ranch. Solar-powered lights lined the long driveway, casting an amber glow through the storm. In the distance, the lights of the main house beckoned like a lighthouse in the darkness. Marcus had built the house himself 20 years ago, after his cattle operation started turning serious profit. It wasn't ostentatious. He'd never been one for showing off, but it was solid and comfortable. A 2-story log and stone structure with a wraparound porch and large windows that looked out over the valley where his cattle grazed. He pulled up to the front entrance and killed the engine. "Sarah, I'm going to carry you both inside, okay? This rain isn't letting up, and I don't want either of you getting any wetter." Before she could protest, Marcus was out of the truck and had the passenger door open. Sarah was lighter than he'd expected, and the baby barely weighed anything at all. He carried them both up the porch steps and through the heavy wooden front door. The warmth of the house hit them immediately. Marcus had left the fireplace burning when he went to town, and the whole living room glowed with golden light. He set Sarah down gently on the leather sofa nearest the fire and went to get towels and blankets from the linen closet. When he returned, Sarah was trying to warm the baby's hands with her breath. Emma was so quiet that for a moment, Marcus worried something might be seriously wrong. "Is she sick?" he asked, kneeling beside the sofa. Sarah shook her head. "Just cold and tired. She's usually more active, but we've been traveling for 3 days straight. I think she's exhausted." Marcus wrapped a thick wool blanket around both of them and added another log to the fire. 3 days? Where did you come from?" "Denver," Sarah said, not meeting his eyes. "We were heading to Montana." "Montana's a big state." "Where exactly?" Sarah hesitated. "Billings. I have an aunt there. Or I think I do. I haven't seen her since I was a child." Something in her tone told Marcus there was much more to this story. But he'd been raised to mind his own business unless someone asked for help. And Sarah clearly needed help, even if she wasn't ready to ask for it directly. "Well, right now the important thing is getting you both warmed up and fed. When's the last time either of you had a proper meal?" Sarah's stomach answered for her, growling loudly enough to be heard over the crackling fire. She blushed. "Yesterday morning, I think. Maybe the day before. I've been trying to make my money stretch." Marcus stood up. "I've got beef stew in the slow cooker, fresh bread, and milk that came from my own cows this morning. Let me fix you both a proper meal." While Marcus worked in the kitchen, he could hear Sarah talking softly to the baby. Her voice was gentle and loving, but there was an undercurrent of sadness that made his chest tight. He'd been around enough people in his 62 years to recognize someone carrying a heavy burden. 20 minutes later, he returned to the living room with a tray loaded with food. Sarah's eyes widened when she saw the portions he'd prepared. "Mr. Sullivan, I can't possibly eat all that." "Marcus," he corrected. "And yes, you can. You're eating for 2, remember?" He nodded toward the baby, who was now awake and looking around with curious brown eyes. As Sarah ate, Marcus could see color returning to her cheeks. The baby seemed more alert, too, reaching for Sarah's hair and making soft cooing sounds. "She's beautiful," Marcus said, and he meant it. Emma had her mother's dark hair and delicate features, but her eyes were a striking green that must have come from her father. At the mention of Emma's beauty, Sarah's face crumpled. Fresh tears started to flow, and she set down her spoon. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I'm not usually like this. It's just been such a hard few days." Marcus handed her a box of tissues from the side table. "No need to apologize. Sometimes crying is exactly what we need to do." Sarah wiped her eyes and took a shaky breath. "You've been so kind to us. I don't know how to thank you." "No thanks needed. This is what neighbors do. But we're not neighbors. We're complete strangers." Marcus smiled. "Out here, everyone's a neighbor until proven otherwise." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, listening to the storm rage outside. Emma fell asleep in Sarah's arms, and Sarah's own eyelids started to droop. "Why don't I show you to a guest room?" Marcus suggested. "You both need a good night's sleep." Sarah looked like she wanted to protest, but exhaustion won out. Marcus led her upstairs to a comfortable bedroom with its own bathroom. The room had a queen-size bed covered in a handmade quilt a rocking chair by the window, and a small crib that had been left behind by previous guests who had brought their own children to visit. "The bathroom is everything you need," Marcus said. "There are some of my late wife's clothes in the closet. She was about your size. Help yourself to anything that fits." Sarah's eyes widened. "Your wife. She passed away 8 years ago. Cancer. But she would have wanted her things to go to someone who needed them." Sarah looked like she was going to cry again. "Mr. Sullivan, Marcus, you don't even know us. Why are you being so generous?" Marcus was quiet for a moment, looking out the window where lightning was still splitting the sky. "My wife, Janet, always said that kindness was the only currency that never lost its value. I guess I've been trying to live up to that ever since she's been gone." After settling Sarah and Emma in their room, Marcus went back downstairs to bank the fire and turn off the lights. But instead of going to bed, he found himself standing by the big-picture window in his living room, looking out at the storm. It had been 8 years since Janet died, and in all that time, the big house had felt empty despite his efforts to fill it with work and purpose. Tonight, with Sarah and the baby sleeping upstairs, it felt like a home again. Marcus had always been a practical man, someone who believed in helping when help was needed, but who didn't get emotionally involved in other people's problems. But something about Sarah and Emma was different. Maybe it was the way Sarah held her daughter, with such fierce protective love, even in the midst of what was clearly a desperate situation. Or maybe it was the quiet dignity with which she'd accepted his help, grateful, but not groveling. Whatever it was, Marcus found himself hoping that the storm would last a little longer, that Sarah's car wouldn't be easily repaired, that maybe they'd need to stay for a few more days. The thought surprised him. It had been a long time since he'd looked forward to having company. Outside, the rain continued to fall, and in the distance, thunder rolled across the mountains like a promise of more storms to come. When Marcus finally went to bed that night, it was to the sound of gentle rain on his roof and the knowledge that upstairs a mother and baby were sleeping safely under his protection. It was a good feeling, better than he'd had in years. But Marcus Sullivan had no idea that by morning, Sarah Chin's story would prove to be far more complicated than a simple car breakdown in a storm. And he had no way of knowing that helping this young mother and her baby would change not just their lives, but his own in ways he could never have imagined. The storm that had brought them together was just the beginning. The real challenge would come with the dawn, when Sarah would have to decide whether to trust this kind stranger with the truth about why she was really running and what she was running from. As the night wore on, the rain gradually softened from a thunderous downpour to a gentle pattering against the windows. In the guest room upstairs, Sarah lay awake holding Emma, staring at the ceiling and wondering if it was possible that her luck had finally turned. For 3 days, she'd been driving with no real destination, just away from the life that had collapsed around her in Denver. Away from the lawyers and the creditors and the reporters. Away from the friends who had turned their backs when the scandal broke. Away from the empty crib in what had been her son's nursery. The thought of Michael brought fresh tears, but Sarah forced them back. She couldn't afford to break down now. Not when she'd finally found a safe place for Emma, even if it was only temporary. She looked down at her daughter, sleeping peacefully for the first time in days. Emma's face was relaxed and content, her tiny fist curled against her cheek. Sarah reached out to gently touch that perfect little hand, marveling again at the miracle of her daughter's existence. Emma was 6 months old now, born healthy and strong despite all the stress Sarah had been under during her pregnancy. Born just 2 weeks after her brother's funeral. Sarah closed her eyes, trying to push away the memories. But lying here in the quiet darkness of Marcus Sullivan's guest room, with her daughter safe in her arms, the past seemed determined to catch up with her. It had started 10 months ago, when baby Michael had gotten sick. At first, the doctor said it was just a cold, then maybe bronchitis. But Michael kept getting worse instead of better. David, her husband, had insisted on taking him to the best specialist money could buy. They'd spared no expense, flying Michael to hospitals in Seattle, Los Angeles, even the Mayo Clinic. But money couldn't save Michael. The genetic condition he'd been born with was too rare, too aggressive. By the time they finally got a proper diagnosis, it was too late. They'd lost their son, and in the process of trying to save him, they'd lost everything else too. The medical bills had been staggering. David's business had suffered while he focused on Michael's care. Their health insurance had covered some of the costs, but not nearly enough. After Michael's death, David had thrown himself into his work with desperate intensity, trying to rebuild their finances. But grief and stress had clouded his judgment. He'd made risky investments, trusted the wrong partners. When the FBI had raided his office 6 weeks ago, Sarah had learned that her husband of 7 years had been involved in a financial scheme that had defrauded investors of millions of dollars. David swore he'd been set up, that he'd had no knowledge of the illegal activities his business partners were conducting. Sarah had wanted to believe him, but the evidence was overwhelming, and the media had painted him as another greedy executive who'd stolen from hardworking people trying to save for retirement. The trial was set to begin in 3 months. David was currently free on a $2 million bond that had required them to sell their house, their cars, everything of value they owned. The lawyers were confident they could prove David's innocence, but Sarah had lost faith and confidence after watching her infant son die despite the confident predictions of a dozen specialists. She'd made the decision to leave Denver 3 days ago, after a reporter had cornered her outside the grocery store, asking if she'd known about her husband's criminal enterprise and whether she was planning to profit from her husband's victims. Emma had been with her, and the camera had been right in their faces. That night, Sarah had packed everything that would fit in her car and left. She'd withdrawn what little cash remained in their personal account, $847, and started driving north with no clear destination in mind. Now, lying in Marcus Sullivan's comfortable guest bed, Sarah wondered if she'd made a terrible mistake. But every time she thought about going back to Denver, she remembered the look in that reporter's eyes, the barely contained hatred. She remembered the former friends who'd stopped returning her calls. She remembered the way people stared at her in the grocery store, whispering behind their hands. Emma stirred in her arms, making soft, sleeping sounds. Sarah kissed the top of her daughter's head and made a silent promise. Whatever it took, she would keep Emma safe. She would give her daughter the childhood that Michael had been denied, full of security and love and hope. But first, she had to figure out how to do that with less than $600 to her name and nowhere to go. Downstairs, Marcus Sullivan was having his own sleepless night, though for very different reasons. Something about Sarah's story didn't add up, and his instincts were telling him there was much more going on than a simple car breakdown. He'd seen enough desperate people over the years to recognize the signs. Sarah wasn't just stranded. She was running from something. The expensive clothes mixed with the worn-out shoes. The high-end diaper bag next to the car held together with tape. The way she'd hesitated when he'd asked where she was going. But Marcus had also seen enough good people hit by hard times to know that sometimes running was the only option left. And whatever Sarah was running from, she was doing it with a baby in her arms, which told him everything he needed to know about her priorities. He made himself a cup of coffee and stood by his kitchen window, watching the storm begin to clear. By dawn, he'd have to make a decision about how much help he was willing to offer. He could drive Sarah into town, help her get her car repaired, and send her on her way to Montana. It would be the safe thing to do, the sensible thing. Or he could offer her something more. He had plenty of room in the house, and God knew he could use the company. His ranch hands could always use extra help during calving season, which was coming up in a few months. And there was something about Sarah, a quiet strength mixed with vulnerability, that reminded him of Janet when they'd first met. Marcus shook his head, surprised by his own thoughts. He was a practical man, not given to romantic notions. But there was no denying that having Sarah and Emma in his house felt right in a way he couldn't quite explain. As the first hint of dawn began to lighten the eastern sky, Marcus made his decision. He would offer Sarah a job and a place to stay, at least until she got back on her feet. What she did with that offer would be up to her. But first, He had a feeling he was going to need to hear the whole truth about what had brought Sarah Chun and her baby daughter to his door in the middle of a Wyoming thunderstorm. The morning sun was just beginning to filter through the curtains when Sarah woke to the sound of Emma fussing. Her daughter was hungry, and Sarah realized with relief that she finally felt rested enough to properly care for her baby. She changed Emma's diaper using supplies from her nearly empty diaper bag, then made her way downstairs to prepare a bottle. The house was quiet, but she could smell coffee and bacon cooking, which meant Marcus was already up. She found him in the kitchen, standing at the stove with his back to her. He'd changed from his wet clothes into jeans and a flannel shirt, and his gray hair was neatly combed. Without the stress of the storm, Sarah could see that Marcus Sullivan was a handsome man, with the kind of steady, dependable presence that made people feel safe. "Good morning," he said, turning around with a smile. "How did you sleep?" "Better than I have in weeks," Sarah admitted. "Thank you again for everything." Marcus waved off her thanks. "Coffee's fresh, and breakfast will be ready in a few minutes. How's the little one this morning?" "Hungry," Sarah said, warming Emma's bottle in a cup of hot water. She usually wakes up in a much better mood. As if to prove her point, Emma stopped fussing the moment Sarah picked her up. Her green eyes were bright and alert as she looked around the unfamiliar kitchen. "She's curious," Marcus observed, offering Emma his finger, which she grabbed with surprising strength. Smart babies always are. They ate breakfast together at Marcus's kitchen table, and Sarah was struck by how normal it felt. For the first time in months, she wasn't worried about money or lawyers or reporters. Emma sat contentedly in Sarah's lap, occasionally reaching for interesting items on the table. "Sarah," Marcus said finally, pushing his empty plate aside, "I hope you don't mind me saying this, but you don't strike me as someone whose biggest problem is a broken-down car." Sarah's hand froze halfway to her coffee cup. She'd known this conversation was coming, but she still wasn't ready for it. "I don't know what you mean," she said quietly. Marcus leaned forward slightly, his expression kind but serious. "I've lived long enough to recognize someone who's running from trouble, and I got enough experience with people to know that sometimes running is the right choice." Sarah felt tears threatening again. She'd been holding everything together for so long, being strong for Emma's sake, that the kindness in Marcus's voice almost broke her resolve. "It's complicated," she whispered. "Most worthwhile things are," Marcus replied. "But here's what I know for sure. You're a good mother, you're in trouble, and you need help. I'd like to offer you that help, but I can't do it blindly." Sarah looked down at Emma, who was playing with the buttons on her shirt. Her daughter deserved better than a mother who was always looking over her shoulder, always afraid of what might be waiting around the next corner. Maybe it was time to trust someone. Maybe it was time to stop running. "My real name is Sarah Chun Morrison," she began, and the relief of saying it out loud was almost overwhelming. "And I think you might have seen my husband on the news." Marcus set down his coffee cup carefully, his expression unchanged. "David Morrison," he said quietly. "The financial advisor from Denver." Sarah nodded, unable to meet his eyes. "You've seen the news reports." "I have." Marcus was quiet for a long moment, studying Sarah's face. "But I've also learned that the news doesn't always tell the whole story." The kindness in his voice made Sarah's chest tight. For weeks, she'd been preparing herself for judgment, for people to assume the worst about her and Emma. Marcus's measured response was so unexpected that she almost started crying again. "Tell me what really happened," Marcus said gently. So Sarah did. Sitting in Marcus Sullivan's warm kitchen with Emma on her lap, she told him about Michael's illness and death, about the crushing medical bills, about David's desperate attempts to save their finances, and how those attempts had led him in a partnership with men who were using his legitimate investment firm to hide their criminal activities. She told him about the FBI raid, about the media circus that had followed, about the former friends who turned their backs when the scandal broke. She told him about the empty nursery she'd had to pack up while David was meeting with lawyers, about the house they'd lost, about the reporters who'd followed her to the grocery store. "I know how it looks," Sarah said when she'd finished. The wife of a man accused of stealing millions, driving around with designer baby clothes and a luxury diaper bag. But those things are from before, from when we thought we had a future. Marcus was quiet for a long time after she finished speaking. Emma had fallen asleep in Sarah's arms, and the only sound in the kitchen was the gentle ticking of an old clock on the wall. "What do you believe about your husband?" Marcus asked finally. Sarah had been asked this question a dozen times by lawyers and reporters, but coming from Marcus, it felt different. Like he actually wanted to know her answer, not just looking for a soundbite or trying to gauge her potential liability. "I believe David made some terrible choices," Sarah said slowly. "I believe he was so desperate to save our family after losing Michael that he ignored warning signs he should have seen. But I don't believe he deliberately stole from anyone. David isn't perfect, but he's not a criminal." Marcus nodded. "And where does that leave you?" "I don't know," Sarah admitted. "The trial starts in 3 months. David's lawyers say they can prove his innocence, but even if they do, our reputation is destroyed. No one's going to trust David with their money again, and the legal fees have taken what little we had left. So you decided to run." "I decided to protect my daughter," Sarah said, a note of defiance creeping into her voice. "Emma doesn't deserve to grow up with cameras in her face and people whispering about her father. She doesn't deserve to pay for his mistakes." "No," Marcus agreed. "She doesn't." They sat in silence again, and Sarah found herself holding her breath, waiting for Marcus's verdict. Would he ask her to leave? Would he call the police? She'd been honest with him, but honesty didn't always guarantee understanding. "Sarah," Marcus said finally, "how much money do you have?" The question was so direct that Sarah was startled into answering truthfully. "Less than $600. "And your car?" "Needs a new transmission. The mechanic in town told me yesterday it would cost at least $1,500 to fix." Marcus rubbed his jaw thoughtfully. "What were you planning to do in Montana?" "Find my aunt, I hope. She might let me stay with her until I can figure something out. Maybe find a job, somewhere where people don't know about David." "Mike." Sarah's cheeks flushed. "I haven't actually called her. We lost touch when I was in college, and I'm not even sure she's still in Billings. But I had to tell you I was going somewhere." Marcus almost smiled at that. "So you're running toward a maybe with less than $600 and a 6-month-old baby." Put like that, it sounded even more desperate than Sarah had realized. "I know it's not much of a plan." "It's not a plan at all," Marcus said bluntly. "It's panic." Sarah felt her defenses rising. "What else was I supposed to do? Stay in Denver and let reporters follow Emma to daycare? Let people point and whisper about her everywhere we go?" "No," Marcus said calmly. "But you could stay here." Sarah stared at him. "What?" "You could stay here," Marcus repeated. "I've got more room than I know what to do with, and I could use the help. Calving season's coming up in a few months, and my ranch hands are all young men who think babies are something that happens to other people. Having someone around who actually knows how to take care of children would be useful." Sarah felt like the kitchen was spinning around her. "Mr. Sullivan, Marcus, you can't be serious. You barely know me." "I know enough," Marcus said firmly. "I know you're a good mother. I know you're honest enough to tell me the truth when you could have kept lying. And I know you're brave enough to sacrifice everything to protect your daughter. But the scandal, what if people find out you're helping the wife of a man accused of financial fraud?" Marcus's expression hardened slightly. "Sarah, I've lived in this county for 40 years. I've employed half the men in 3 towns at one time or another, and I've never cheated anyone out of a dime. My reputation can withstand some gossip." "It's not just gossip," Sarah protested. "There could be reporters, federal investigators. Let them come," Marcus said with a shrug. "I'm not hiding anything." Sarah looked down at Emma, who was still sleeping peacefully despite the intensity of the conversation around her. The offer was more generous than anything she could have hoped for, but it also felt too good to be true. "Why?" she asked quietly. "Why would you take such a risk for strangers?" Marcus was quiet for a moment, looking out the window toward his pastures where cattle were beginning to graze in the morning sun. "My wife and I tried for years to have children," he said finally. "It never happened for us. Janet used to say that maybe we were meant to help other people's children instead." He turned back to Sarah, and she saw a depth of sadness in his eyes that matched her own. After she died, I kept meaning to do something about that. Set up scholarships, volunteer with youth programs. But I never got around to it. Maybe this is my chance. Sarah felt tears starting again, but this time they were tears of relief rather than despair. I can't pay you anything. I'm not asking for payment, Marcus interrupted. I'm offering you a job. Room and board plus a salary. Nothing fancy, but enough to help you get back on your feet. What kind of job? General ranch work. Helping with the cattle, maintaining equipment, keeping the books. Plus helping out with hospitality when I have business guests. I do a lot of entertaining during cattle buying season. Sarah tried to imagine herself doing ranch work, but her experience was limited to the suburban life she'd shared with David. I don't know anything about cattle. You can learn. The boys will teach you, and I'll teach you what they can't. Emma stirred in her arms, and Sarah looked down at her daughter's peaceful face. Here was a chance for Emma to grow up somewhere safe, somewhere beautiful, with people who cared about her welfare. Here was a chance for Sarah to rebuild her life on her own terms, away from the judgment and whispers of Denver. But accepting Marcus's offer also meant admitting that her marriage to David was really over. It meant accepting that the life she'd built with him, the house, the plans, the dreams they'd shared, was gone forever. I need to think about it, Sarah said finally. Marcus nodded. Of course you do. Take your time. But even as she said it, Sarah knew what her answer would be. She'd been running away from Denver for 3 days, but sitting here in Marcus Sullivan's kitchen, she realized what she'd really been running toward. A chance to start over. A chance to build something new and good for Emma. A chance to stop being David Morrison's wife and start being Sarah Chin again. After breakfast, Marcus offered to drive Sarah into town to check on her car and call her aunt in Montana. The storm had passed completely, leaving behind a crystal-clear morning that made the mountains look like a postcard. As they drove, Marcus pointed out landmarks and told her about the history of the area. His ranch bordered the national forest, which meant miles of wilderness where Emma could grow up exploring and learning about nature. The nearest town was small but had good schools and a close-knit community where everyone looked out for each other's children. It's not like Denver, Marcus said as they drove down the main street past a hardware store, a diner, and a small grocery market. There's not much here for someone used to big city life. Sarah looked around at the clean streets and the mountains rising in the distance. It looks perfect to me. The mechanic confirmed what Sarah had already known. Her car was going to need expensive repairs that she couldn't afford. But he was willing to hold on to it until she could figure out what to do, and he didn't seem to recognize her from any news reports. Sarah's call to her aunt in Montana was less successful. The number she'd found online was disconnected, and directory assistants had no listing for her aunt's married name. Her backup plan was officially gone. So, Marcus said as they drove back toward the ranch, "Have you made your decision?" Sarah looked back at Emma, who was secured in her car seat and gazing out the window with wide, curious eyes. "If I stay, I want to contribute something real. I don't want to be a charity case." "You won't be," Marcus assured her. "I meant what I said about needing help. The ranch is too big for one person to manage alone. And if the media finds me here, if it becomes a problem for you." Marcus was quiet for a moment. "Sarah, I won't lie to you. There might be some difficult conversations ahead. But I've weathered storms before, literal and otherwise. I think I can handle whatever comes." "Okay," Sarah said, the word coming out in a rush before she could change her mind. "Okay, I'll stay. At least until I can save enough money to get back on my feet." Marcus smiled, and Sarah realized it was the first genuine smile she'd seen from him. It transformed his entire face, making him look younger and more relaxed. "Welcome to Sullivan Ranch," he said. The next few hours passed in a blur of practical arrangements. Marcus helped Sarah move her few belongings from her broken-down car to the ranch. He showed her around the property, the main house, the guest house where his ranch hands lived during busy season, the barn where prize bulls were housed, the pastures where hundreds of cattle grazed peacefully. The scale of the operation was impressive. Marcus owned 15,000 acres, most of it prime, grazing land that had been in his family for 3 generations. But what struck Sarah most was how well cared for everything was. The fences were in perfect repair, the buildings were maintained, and the cattle looked healthy and content. My grandfather started with 200 acres and a dozen head of cattle, Marcus explained as they walked through the main barn. My father expanded it, and I've been lucky enough to keep growing it. Lucky? Sarah asked, watching Marcus check on a pregnant heifer with the gentle competence of someone who'd been doing this work his entire life. Lucky and stubborn, Marcus corrected with a slight smile. There'd been droughts, market crashes, disease outbreaks. Plenty of times when selling out would have been the smart move. But this land gets into your blood. Once you understand what it means to be responsible for all this, he gestured toward the pastures. It's hard to imagine doing anything else. Sarah could hear the love in his voice, the deep satisfaction of a man who'd found his calling and stuck with it through good times and bad. It made her think of David, who'd been passionate about his work too, until desperation had driven him to make choices that went against everything he'd once believed in. That afternoon, while Emma napped, Sarah called David's lawyer from Marcus's landline. The conversation was brief and uncomfortable. David was focused on his legal defense, and he seemed distant when Sarah told him she was staying in Wyoming for a while. With some rancher you just met. David sounded incredulous. Sarah, that doesn't sound safe. It's safer than staying in Denver with reporters following me to the grocery store, Sarah replied. I know things have been difficult, but once the trial's over, once I'm cleared of these charges, we can rebuild. We can start fresh. Sarah closed her eyes, hearing the hope in David's voice and wishing she could share it. David, even if you're acquitted, our life in Denver is over. You know that, right? Your business is gone. Our house is gone. Our friends won't return our calls. We can move somewhere else, start over together. Where? With what money? And how do I know you won't make the same kind of desperate choices again when things get hard? The silence on the other end of the line stretched so long that Sarah wondered if the call had been disconnected. I never meant for any of this to happen, David said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. I know, Sarah said, and she meant it. But meaning well isn't enough anymore. I have to think about Emma now. After she hung up, Sarah sat in Marcus's living room, feeling like she'd just closed the door on 10 years of her life. She'd met David when she was 22, just out of college and working her first real job. He'd been older, successful, confident in a way that had made her feel secure. For 8 years, they'd built what she'd thought was a solid life together. Then Michael had died, and everything had fallen apart. Emma woke from her nap, hungry and cranky, and Sarah welcomed the distraction of caring for her daughter. By the time Marcus returned from checking on his cattle, Sarah had fed Emma and was giving her a bath in the kitchen sink, which was just the right size for a 6-month-old. She likes the water, Marcus observed, watching Emma splash happily. She's always been a good baby, Sarah said, wrapping Emma in a soft towel. Even when she was newborn and I was falling apart after Michael's funeral, she seemed to know I needed her to be easy. Tell me about Michael, Marcus said gently. So Sarah did. She told him about her son's bright smile and curious nature, about the way he'd grabbed her finger with surprising strength, about the night terrors she'd had after his diagnosis when she'd wake up convinced she could hear him crying. The worst part, Sarah said, settling into the rocking chair with Emma in her arms, was that we never got to know who he would have been. He died before his personality really emerged, before he learned to say mama or daddy. All we have are 3 months of memories. Marcus listened without offering platitudes or trying to fix her pain, which was exactly what Sarah needed. When she finished talking, he simply nodded and said he was lucky to have you as his mother, even for such a short time. That evening, Marcus cooked dinner while Sarah played with Emma on a blanket spread on the living room floor. The house felt peaceful in a way Sarah hadn't experienced in months. Emma was content and alert, reaching for toys and babbling happily. For the first time since Michael's death, Sarah felt like she could breathe. Marcus, she said as they ate dinner. Why did you never remarry after your wife died? Marcus considered the question while he chewed thoughtfully. Janet was the love of my life, he said finally. After she was gone, I couldn't imagine trying to replace what we'd had. And, honestly, I've been too busy with the ranch to think much about it. Do you ever get lonely? Sometimes, especially in the winter when the work slows down. He looked around the big house. This place was meant for a family. Janet and I always planned to fill it with children and grandchildren. I'm sorry you never got that chance. Life doesn't always give us what we plan for, Marcus said with a slight smile. But sometimes it gives us something we didn't know we needed. After dinner, Sarah helped Marcus with the dishes while Emma sat in her bouncy seat, watching them work. The routine felt comfortable and domestic in a way that surprised Sarah. She hadn't expected to feel so at home so quickly. Tomorrow I'll introduce you to the ranch hands, Marcus said as they finished cleaning up. Jake's been with me for 5 years. He's my foreman. Good man, knows cattle better than anyone. Tom and Miguel are newer, but they're hard workers. Will they mind having a woman around? They're good boys, Marcus assured her. They'll look out for you and Emma. That night, after putting Emma to bed in the crib Marcus had set up in her room, Sarah stood by her window, looking out over the moonlit pastures. In the distance, she could see cattle moving slowly through the grass, and the sight was oddly soothing. For the first time in months, Sarah felt hopeful about the future. She didn't know how long she'd stay at the ranch, or what would happen when David's trial was over, but right now Emma was safe and happy, and that was enough. Downstairs, Marcus was having similar thoughts as he sat by his fireplace with a book he wasn't really reading. Having Sarah and Emma in his house felt right in a way that surprised him. For years, he'd filled his time with work and community obligations, but he'd been going through the motions rather than truly living. Tonight, listening to Sarah give Emma a bath, hearing the soft sounds of a baby in his house again, Marcus felt more alive than he had since Janet's death. He knew there were challenges ahead. Sarah was still legally married to a man facing federal charges. There would be questions from neighbors, possibly unwanted attention from media. And Sarah herself was still healing from the loss of her son and the collapse of her marriage. But Marcus had built his ranch by taking calculated risks, by investing in things he believed had potential for growth. Looking at Sarah tonight, the way she'd listened to his stories about the land, the gentle competence with which she cared for her daughter, the quiet strength that had carried her through unimaginable loss, Marcus believed he was making another good investment. The next morning dawned clear and cold, with frost covering the grass and steam rising from the cattle's breath as they grazed. Sarah woke to the sound of men's voices outside and the rumble of truck engines. She dressed quickly and made her way downstairs with Emma, finding Marcus in the kitchen already dressed for work. "The boys are here," he explained, handing her a cup of coffee. "Ready to meet your new co-workers?" Sarah's stomach fluttered with nerves, but she nodded. She'd committed to this new life, and that meant jumping in with both feet. The 3 ranch hands were gathered around Marcus's kitchen table, maps and papers spread out before them. They looked up as Sarah entered with Emma in her arms, their expressions curious but not unfriendly. "Boys, I'd like you to meet Sarah Chun and her daughter Emma," Marcus said. "Sarah's going to be helping out around here." Jake, the foreman, was a tall man in his 30s with sun-weathered hands and kind eyes. Tom was younger, maybe mid-20s, with the eager energy of someone still learning his trade. Miguel was somewhere in between, with the calm competence that came from years of hard work. "Ma'am," Jake said, standing and offering Sarah his hand. "Welcome to Sullivan Ranch." Tom and Miguel followed suit, and Sarah was struck by their respectful manners. These were men who'd been raised to treat women with courtesy, the kind of old-fashioned politeness that was becoming rare in the modern world. "Emma's beautiful," Tom said, making faces at the baby until she smiled. "How old is she?" 6 months, Sarah replied, feeling some of her nervousness ease. "She's usually pretty friendly." "Well, she'll have plenty of uncles around here," Miguel said with a grin. We don't get many babies on the ranch. As the men discussed the day's work, moving cattle to a different pasture, repairing fence line damaged by the storm, checking on pregnant cows, Sarah listened and tried to absorb the rhythm of ranch life. It was very different from the corporate world she'd known in Denver, but there was something appealing about the straightforward nature of the work, the direct connection between effort and results. Sarah will be working with me this morning, Marcus told the men, learning the basics of cattle management. This afternoon, she'll help with office work. After the ranch hands left to begin their day, Marcus handed Sarah a pair of work boots that had belonged to his wife. They might be a little big, but they'll protect your feet. Cattle ranching isn't a job for sneakers. Sarah strapped Emma into a baby carrier that Marcus had produced from somewhere, apparently left behind by visiting relatives, and followed him out to the pastures. The morning air was crisp and clean, filled with the sounds of cattle lowing and birds singing. The first thing to understand, Marcus said as they walked among the cattle, is that each animal is an individual. They have personalities, preferences, moods. The better you know them, the better you can care for them. He pointed out different breeds, explained the basics of cattle nutrition and health management, showed her how to spot signs of illness or injury. Emma seemed fascinated by the large animals, reaching out toward them with curiosity rather than fear. She's going to grow up thinking this is normal, Sarah realized, watching her daughter's wide-eyed interest in everything around them. That's not a bad thing, Marcus said. Kids who grow up on ranches learn responsibility early. They understand where food comes from, how much work goes into producing it. They develop a work ethic that serves them well no matter what they end up doing. As the morning progressed, Sarah found herself genuinely interested in what Marcus was teaching her. There was a science to cattle ranching that she hadn't expected, a complexity that went far beyond just letting animals graze in a field. It's like running a small city, she said as Marcus explained the logistics of feeding hundreds of animals during winter months. Exactly. And, like any city, it only works if everyone does their job. By lunchtime, Sarah's legs were tired from walking through uneven pastures, but she felt energized in a way she hadn't experienced in months. The physical work, combined with the fresh air and sunshine, had cleared her head of the anxiety that had been her constant companion since Michael's death. The afternoon was spent in Marcus's home office, where he showed her the ranch's computer systems and accounting software. Sarah's background in business made this part easier, and she quickly grasped the financial side of the operation. "You're good at this," Marcus said, watching her navigate through spreadsheets that tracked feed costs, veterinary expenses, and breeding records. "Have you done bookkeeping before?" "I help David with his business sometimes," Sarah said, then stopped. It was the first time she'd mentioned her husband without feeling a sharp stab of pain and betrayal. "That experience will be useful here," Marcus said simply, not pushing for details she wasn't ready to share. That evening, after Emma was asleep and the day's work was done, Sarah and Marcus sat on his front porch watching the sunset paint the mountains in shades of orange and purple. "Thank you," Sarah said quietly, "for giving me this chance." "Thank you for taking it," Marcus replied. "This place has been too quiet for too long." As darkness settled over the ranch and the first stars appeared in the clear Wyoming sky, Sarah felt something she hadn't experienced in almost a year: peace. For the first time since Michael's death, she could imagine a future that held more than just survival. It wouldn't be the future she planned with David, but it could be something good, something real, something built on honest work and genuine kindness rather than the shifting foundations of wealth and status that had proven so fragile. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new lessons to learn, new decisions to make about her marriage and her future. But tonight, Sarah was content to sit in the gathering darkness with a good man and listen to the sound of cattle settling down for the night, knowing that she and Emma were safe, valued, and home. 3 months passed like pages, turning in a book Sarah had never expected to read. Spring arrived on Sullivan Ranch with a burst of wildflowers and the urgent business of calving season. Sarah threw herself into the work with determination that surprised even Marcus, learning to assist with difficult births, tend to newborn calves, and manage the complex logistics of a working cattle operation. Emma thrived in the mountain air. At 9 months old, she was crawling everywhere, pulling herself up on furniture, and babbling in what sounded almost like conversation. The ranch hands had adopted her as their unofficial mascot, taking turns entertaining her while Sarah worked and competing to see who could make her laugh the loudest. She's going to be trouble, Jake predicted one morning, watching Emma crawl at top speed toward a fascinating hay bale. Smart babies always are. Sarah scooped up her daughter before she could reach her destination. She gets that from her father, she said automatically, then froze. For weeks, she'd been managing not to think about David except when his lawyer called with updates about the trial preparation. The trial was set to begin in 2 weeks, and Sarah knew she couldn't avoid thinking about it much longer. David's lawyers had been calling more frequently, asking if she'd testify on his behalf. So far, she'd managed to avoid giving them a definitive answer. "You're worried about something," Marcus observed that evening as they sat on his porch after dinner. It had become their routine, working hard all day, then spending the peaceful hour after Emma's bedtime talking about everything and nothing. "The trial starts soon," Sarah admitted. "David's lawyers want me to testify." Marcus was quiet for a moment, rocking slowly in his chair. "What do they want you to say?" "That David's a good man who got in over his head. That he would never deliberately steal from anyone. That he was so grief-stricken after losing Michael that he wasn't thinking clearly." "And is that what you believe?" Sarah had been asking herself the same question for weeks. "I believe parts of it. David isn't evil. But he made choices, Marcus. He kept making them even after he should have known better." "What does your gut tell you about testifying?" Sarah looked out over the darkening pastures where fireflies were beginning to flicker like tiny stars. "My gut tells me that going back to Denver, even for a few days, would be a mistake. That Emma and I have finally found our footing here, and stirring up the past could destroy that." "Then, don't go," Marcus said simply. "It's not that easy. David is still my husband. We may not have much of a marriage left, but I can't just abandon him completely." Marcus reached over and covered her hand with his. The gesture was gentle and warm, and Sarah realized it was the first time a man had touched her with tenderness since before Michael's death. "Sarah, you're not responsible for saving David from the consequences of his choices. You're only responsible for protecting yourself and Emma." The next morning, Sarah called David's lawyer and declined to testify. The conversation was difficult and guilt-inducing, but when it was over, she felt lighter than she had in weeks. That afternoon brought an unexpected visitor. Sarah was in the barn helping Jake with a cow who was having difficulty calving when Marcus appeared in the doorway with a grim expression. "Sarah, there's a reporter here asking questions about you." Sarah's blood ran cold. She'd known this day might come, but she'd hoped they'd have more time before the media found her. "What kind of questions?" "The kind that suggest he already knows more than I'd like him to know," Marcus said grimly. "He's waiting by the front gate. Says he just wants to talk." Sarah looked at Emma, who was napping peacefully in her portable crib in the barn's office. For 3 months, her daughter had lived without the shadow of scandal hanging over her. Now that peace was about to be shattered. "I'll talk to him," Sarah said, wiping her hands on her jeans. "No," Marcus said firmly. "You'll stay here with Emma. I'll handle this." "Marcus, I can't let you fight my battles for me. You're not letting me do anything. I'm choosing to do it." His expression softened slightly. "Sarah, this is my ranch, my property. I decide who gets to come here and ask questions." 20 minutes later, Marcus returned to find Sarah pacing nervously in the barn. "He's gone," Marcus announced. "For now." "What did you tell him?" "That you're an employee of Sullivan Ranch, that your personal life is none of his business, and that he's not welcome on my property." Sarah felt a wave of gratitude so strong it made her dizzy. "Thank you. But he'll be back, won't he? With cameras and more questions." "Probably," Marcus admitted. "The question is, what do you want to do about it?" That evening, After Emma was asleep, Sarah and Marcus had the conversation she'd been dreading. They sat in his living room with the fireplace crackling, and Sarah tried to find the courage to say what needed to be said. "I should leave," she said finally, "before this gets any worse. Before it damages your reputation or your business." Marcus leaned forward in his chair. "Is that what you want?" "What I want doesn't matter. I won't let my problems hurt you or the ranch." "Sarah, look at me." When she met his eyes, Marcus continued. "You've worked harder in the past 3 months than some people work in a year. You've earned your place here, scandal or no scandal. The question isn't whether you should leave, it's whether you want to stay." Sarah felt tears threatening. "Of course I want to stay. This has been the happiest Emma, and I have been since, well, maybe ever." But, nothing," Marcus interrupted. "This is your home now, if you want it to be. One reporter doesn't change that. It won't be just one reporter. When the trial starts, there will be more media attention. They'll want to know where David Morrison's wife disappeared to, whether I'm hiding assets, whether I knew about his illegal activities." "Let them come," Marcus said with quiet determination. "I've lived in this county for 40 years. People here know who I am and what I stand for. They're not going to turn on me because some tabloid reporter doesn't like who I choose to employ." The trial began the following Monday, and with it came the media circus Sarah had been dreading. By Wednesday, 2 more reporters had shown up at the ranch, both asking invasive questions about Sarah's relationship with Marcus and whether she was hiding money or assets on his property. Marcus handled each encounter with the same calm firmness, but Sarah could see the strain was wearing on him. The ranch hands were protective of her and Emma, but the constant scrutiny was affecting everyone's ability to work. The breaking point came Thursday morning when Sarah discovered a photographer with a telephoto lens hiding in the tree line near the house, trying to get pictures of her and Emma through the kitchen window. "That's it," Sarah said, her protective instincts as a mother overriding everything else. "This has to stop." She marched outside to confront the photographer herself. "Excuse me," she called out. "This is private property." The man lowered his camera and walked toward her with a predatory smile. "Mrs. Morrison, just a few questions about your new living arrangement. My name is Sarah Chun, and you're trespassing. Is it true you're romantically involved with Marcus Sullivan? Are you using his ranch to hide assets from federal investigators?" Sarah felt her temper rising. "I'm going to ask you one more time to leave this property. The public has a right to know if David Morrison's wife is profiting from his crimes." "The public," Sarah said with ice-cold calm, "can mind their own business." The photographer raised his camera again, aiming it directly at her face. Before Sarah could react, Marcus appeared beside her and calmly reached out to cover the lens with his hand. "Sir, you're on private property without permission," Marcus said in the tone of voice he usually reserved for stubborn bulls. "You need to leave immediately." "I'm exercising my First Amendment rights. On my land, you'll exercise your right to get in your car and drive away," Marcus interrupted, "before I call the sheriff." The photographer reluctantly packed up his equipment, but not before getting off a few more questions. "Mr. Sullivan, are you aware that harboring a fugitive is a federal crime? Are you aware that trespassing is a state crime?" Marcus countered, "I'd suggest you worry about your own legal problems." After the man left, Sarah sank down on the porch steps with her head in her hands. "This isn't working, Marcus. I can't keep putting you in this position." Marcus sat down beside her. "Sarah, that man was trying to provoke you into saying something stupid. Don't let him win. It's not about winning or losing. It's about what's best for Emma." Sarah looked up at him with tears in her eyes. "Every day I stay here, I'm putting you at risk. Your business, your reputation, your peace of mind. Those are my risks to take. But why would you want to take them? For someone you barely knew 3 months ago." Marcus was quiet for a long moment, looking out over his ranch where cattle were grazing peacefully in the afternoon sun. "Can I tell you about the day Jana died?" he said finally. Sarah nodded, sensing this was important. She'd been sick for 2 years. Cancer. We both knew the end was coming, but we kept fighting anyway, kept hoping for miracles that didn't come. Marcus's voice was soft with memory. "The last day she was conscious, she made me promise her something. What? She said, Marcus, you're going to want to shut yourself off after I'm gone. You're going to think that caring about people is too risky, too painful. But that would be the real tragedy. She made me promise that I'd keep my heart open to love, even if it meant getting hurt again. Sarah felt her breath catch. Marcus, I kept that promise by taking care of the ranch, by being good to my employees, by being generous with my community. But I never let anyone get close enough to really matter. He turned to look at her directly. Until you and Emma showed up in that storm. Sarah stared at him, seeing the vulnerability in his weathered face. Are you saying? I'm saying that I've fallen in love with both of you, Marcus said simply. Not just with the idea of having a family, but with you specifically, with your strength, your devotion to Emma, your willingness to work hard for what you believe in. I'm saying that chasing you away would break my heart worse than anything those reporters could do to my reputation. Sarah felt the world shift around her. She'd been so focused on protecting Marcus from her problems that she'd failed to recognize what was growing between them. But now that he'd said it out loud, she realized she felt the same way. I love you too, she whispered, the words feeling strange and wonderful on her tongue. I didn't mean for it to happen, but I do. Marcus reached for her hands. Then, stop talking about leaving. Stop trying to protect me from choices I'm making with my eyes wide open. But what about David? I'm still married. For now, Marcus said gently. But, Sarah, that marriage was over before you ever got to Wyoming. You know that as well as I do. That evening, Sarah called David's lawyer again, this time to discuss filing for divorce. The conversation was difficult, but necessary. She wasn't abandoning David in his time of need. She was acknowledging that their marriage had become another casualty of the tragedy that had destroyed their lives. The trial continued for another week, dominating the news cycle and keeping reporters circling the ranch like vultures. But Marcus was true to his word about weathering the storm. When a local newspaper ran an editorial criticizing him for harboring a criminal's wife, 36 community leaders wrote letters to the editor defending his character and his right to hire whoever he chose. When a tabloid published grainy photos of Sarah and Emma on the ranch with the headline Millionaire's Hideaway, Marcus's lawyer sent cease and desist letters that made the publication think twice about future stories. And when federal investigators showed up to ask Sarah questions about David's business dealings, Marcus arranged for her to meet with them in his lawyer's office rather than on the ranch, protecting both her rights and Emma's privacy. Throughout it all, Sarah was amazed by the quiet strength of the man who'd taken her in during her darkest hour. Marcus never lost his temper with reporters, never complained about the disruption to his peaceful life, never once suggested that he regretted his decision to help her. The trial ended on a Friday with a mixed verdict that satisfied no one. David was convicted on 2 counts of financial fraud, but acquitted on the more serious charges of intentional theft. He would serve 2 years in minimum security prison, a sentence that was both too harsh and too lenient, depending on who was asking. Sarah felt surprisingly little emotion when she heard the verdict. The man she'd married seemed like a stranger now, someone from a different lifetime. Her real life was here on Sullivan Ranch, with Marcus and Emma and the work that had given her purpose again. That weekend, with the trial over and media attention finally beginning to fade, Marcus made an announcement that surprised everyone. I'm thinking about selling some of the ranch, he told Sarah as they sat on the porch watching Emma take her first wobbly steps across the yard. Sarah looked at him in alarm. Marcus, if this is about the scandal, about people giving you trouble for helping me, it's not about that, Marcus assured her. It's about Emma. What about Emma? Marcus smiled as he watched the little girl stumble and get back up with determined persistence. She's going to need college money someday, and maybe a wedding fund, and probably seed money for whatever business venture she decides to start when she gets older. Sarah felt her heart swell with love for this man who was already thinking about her daughter's future as if Emma were his own child. Marcus Sullivan, are you planning to adopt my daughter? Only if you'll let me, Marcus said seriously, and only if you'll marry me first. Sarah stared at him, speechless. She'd hoped that someday, After her divorce was final and the scandal had faded, they might talk about making their relationship official. But she hadn't expected this conversation so soon. "Are you asking?" Marcus got up from his chair and walked over to where Emma was playing with a collection of smooth river stones. He picked up the little girl, who squealed with delight, and immediately started grabbing for his hat. "Emma," Marcus said solemnly, "I'd like your permission to ask your mother to marry me. Would that be okay with you?" Emma babbled something that sounded like agreement and clapped her hands. Marcus carried Emma back to the porch and knelt down in front of Sarah's chair, the baby still in his arms. "Sarah Chun, you came into my life during a storm, and you've been my sunshine ever since. Will you marry me? Will you let me be Emma's father? Will you help me turn this ranch into the home it was always meant to be?" Sarah looked at this good man holding her daughter, offering them both a love that was steady and real and permanent. She thought about the life she'd lost in Denver, the wealth and status that had proved so fragile, and compared it to what Marcus was offering. Not luxury, but security. Not excitement, but peace. Not passion that burns out quickly, but love that would last a lifetime. "Yes," she said through happy tears. "Yes to all of it." 6 months later, on a crisp October morning with the aspen trees golden on the mountainsides, Sarah Chun married Marcus Sullivan in a small ceremony on the ranch. Emma, now walking confidently, served as an enthusiastic if unpredictable flower girl, more interested in chasing butterflies than dropping petals. The guest list was small: Marcus's ranch hands, a few neighbors, Sarah's sister who flew in from California. David wasn't there, of course. He was serving his sentence and had graciously signed the divorce papers without contest, acknowledging that Sarah deserved a chance at happiness. Jake, now the ranch's general manager, gave a toast that made everyone laugh and cry. To Sarah, who taught us that sometimes the best things come from the worst storms. And to Marcus, who proved that a good man with an open heart can change everything. As Sarah and Marcus danced to their first song as husband and wife, Emma tottered between guests, collecting cuddles and cookies with equal enthusiasm. The little girl who had started life as the daughter of a scandal had become the beloved child of a rancher, with 3 honorary uncles who spoiled her shamelessly and a stepfather who was already teaching her to recognize different cattle breeds. "Any regrets?" Marcus asked as they swayed to the music. Sarah looked around at their wedding guests, people who'd welcomed her without judgment, who defended her during the worst of the scandal, who become the family she'd never known she needed. She looked at Emma, healthy and happy and completely at home in this wide-open space. She looked at Marcus, whose quiet strength had given her the courage to rebuild her life from nothing. "Only one," Sarah said. Marcus raised an eyebrow, concerned. "I wish Janet could have met Emma," Sarah said softly. "I think she would have loved her." Marcus smiled, the kind of smile that crinkled the corners of his eyes and made him look younger. "I think she would have loved you both. And I think she would have been proud of us for keeping the promise she made me make." As the sun set over Sullivan Ranch on their wedding day, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, Sarah reflected on the long journey that had brought her to this moment. She'd lost so much: her son, her first marriage, the comfortable life she'd built in Denver. But she'd gained something more valuable than anything she'd lost: a love that was honest and strong, a home that felt truly permanent, and a future that stretched ahead full of possibility. Emma would grow up here, learning to ride horses and tend cattle, surrounded by people who adored her. She'd go to the small local school where teachers knew every student's name, play in mountain streams, and fall asleep every night to the sound of wind through pine trees. And someday, when Emma was old enough to understand, Sarah would tell her the story of the night they'd been rescued from a storm by a good man with a generous heart. She'd tell her daughter that sometimes the worst things that happen to us lead directly to the best things, and that home isn't a place. It's the people who love us unconditionally. 5 years later, Sarah stood in the same barn where she'd first learned to assist with calving, watching her daughter, now 6 years old and completely fearless, helped Marcus examine a newborn calf. Emma was chattering away about the calf's markings, already showing the keen eye for livestock that Marcus had been patiently developing. "Mama, look how strong he is," Emma called out, giggling as the calf tried to nurse on her finger. Sarah smiled, thinking about how much their lives had changed since that stormy night when Marcus had found them on the side of the road. The ranch was thriving under their joint management. Sarah had discovered a talent for the business side of cattle ranching, and her marketing innovations had significantly increased their profits. They'd used some of that increased income to expand the ranch's operations, but they'd also quietly funded college scholarships for local students and contributed to the regional children's hospital where Emma had been born. Emma went to school in town, but spent her afternoons and weekends on the ranch, equally comfortable in a classroom and a pasture. She could ride a horse before she could ride a bicycle, knew the names of every cow on the ranch, and had already announced her intention to be a veterinarian specializing in large animals. "She's going to be something special," Marcus said, joining Sarah at the fence where she was watching their daughter. "She already is," Sarah replied, slipping her arm around her husband's waist. As they stood together watching Emma play with the calf, Sarah thought about the woman she'd been when she'd first arrived at Sullivan Ranch, broken, desperate, running from everything that had gone wrong in her life. That woman couldn't have imagined this future, the peace, the joy, the sense of being exactly where she belonged. The storm that had brought her to Marcus's door had seemed like another tragedy at the time, just one more thing going wrong in a life that had already fallen apart. But standing here in the warm afternoon sunshine, surrounded by the life they'd built together, Sarah understood that sometimes what looks like the end of your story is actually just the beginning. Emma came running over to them, her small hands dirty from playing with the calf, her face bright with excitement. "Daddy Marcus," she said, using the name she'd created for the man who'd raised her since she was 9 months old. "Can we name the calf Storm? Because he was born during a thunderstorm last night." Marcus looked at Sarah with a smile that held 5 years of shared memories, shared dreams, and shared love. "I think Storm is a perfect name," he said, lifting Emma up so she could see over the fence. "After all, the best things in our lives came from Storm." Emma clapped her hands in delight, already planning adventures with her new four-legged friend. And Sarah felt her heart fill with gratitude for the storm that had ended one life and begun another, the storm that had brought them home.